Right, Year 10. We are going to read Stave 4 of 5 today. There's 3 reading lessons left. Stave 4 is a pretty important one, so make sure you've got your copy of the novel in front of you. If you do not, then please write down any quotes that I highlight and annotate them straight into your book. So this is Stave 4, the last of the spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. So it's not one of our flashcard quotes, but I really like that triplet. Escalates fear. So triplets escalate, so they go 1, that's bad, 2, that's worse, 3, now I'm terrified. So the fear kind of moves up a pitch every time you add an adjective. So the triplet of adjectives escalates that fear. So slowly is pretty ominous. Gravely, so very seriously, but grave also associated with death. And then silently, very, very ominous, that. Okay, so the phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. So really gothic description, isn't it? Gloom, mystery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment. Now this is one of our flashcard quotes, so I'll just finish the sentence and then we'll annotate it. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save the one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. Okay, so it blends in with the night and can't be seen against the night. So we've got garment for one, which is a very non-specific word, isn't it? It's quite vague and therefore it makes us feel uneasy. It's really hard to define. Shrouded has connotations of death. So when you would bury someone, you would wrap them in cloths, and that was called a death shroud. So shrouded means wrapped in cloth. And then of course we have this colour, which is dark, it's gloomy, and people in the Victorian era would wear black when they're in mourning. So the fact that this imagery of a figure dressed in black is here shows that it's kind of connotations of death. So we link wearing black to death and funerals. Okay, right, let's carry on. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved. So the spirit doesn't speak and it's pretty still. It's almost like a statue. So it adds to this sense of things being nothing away. I am in the presence of the ghosts of Christmas yet to come, said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand. You are about to show me the shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in time before us, Scrooge pursued. Is that so, spirit? The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he prepared to follow it. The spirit paused a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague uncertain horror to know that behind the dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black. Okay, so we've got the fact that Scrooge is terrified because the spirit seems to see him, but he can't see its eyes, and that freaks him out. Now, this isn't a flashcard quote, but annotate it anyway. The spectral hand, this imagery. So, hand has connotations of guidance, and also judgment. So imagine, pointing someone in the way they need to go, guiding them. But at the same time, you could point at someone accusingly as you're judging them. So the spectral hand, we don't know what its purpose is yet, but we feel that it's trying to guide Scrooge towards the right path. "Ghost of the future," he exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre I have seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this, but these sentences that describe the spirit are always quite short. Yeah? So when Scrooge asks the spirit something, the response is always in a short sentence. So you've got Scrooge with his long, rambly, kind of worrisome sentences, and then the spirit being very abrupt, being very short. But also those short sentences really help to add to this ominous, fearful atmosphere. "Lead on," said Scrooge, "lead on. The night is waning fast, and it's precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved... Sorry, just need to straighten this up. The phantom moved away as it had come towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring about them and encompass them of its own act. But there they were in the heart of it, on 'change, amongst merchants, who hurried up and down and chinked the money in their pockets and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches and trifled thoughtfully with their great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a very large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first with a yawn. "What has he done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman with a pendulous excrescence on the end of his nose that shook like the gills of a turkey-cock. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a very cheap funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer?" "I don't mind going if lunch is provided," observed the gentleman with the excrescence on his nose, "but I must be fed if I make one." Another laugh. "Well, I am the most disinterested among you all, after all," said the first speaker, "for I never wear black gloves and I never eat lunch. But I'll offer to go if anybody else will. When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure that I wasn't his most particular friend, for we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Bye-bye." Speakers and listeners strolled away and mixed with other groups. Scrooge knew the men and looked towards the spirit for explanation. So, we know that this person has money, but then it's going to be a very cheap funeral. So there's no one to pay for it, or maybe not an expensive funeral because there's no one to cater for, no one will be there. So we have here a juxtaposition. Wealth here versus cheap. And suggestion that there is a lack of attendees, not that he's too poor to pay for a funeral. Okay, hope that makes sense. Okay, so we are going to pick up here, the phantom. The phantom glided on into a street. Its finger pointed to two persons meeting. Scrooge listened again, thinking that the explanation might lie here. He knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. He had always made a point of standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, that is, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, hey?" "So I'm told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You're not a skater, I suppose?" "No, no, something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. Scrooge was at first inclined to be surprised that the spirits should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his own partner, for that was past, and this ghost province was future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself to whom he could apply them. But nothing doubting that to whomsoever they applied, they had some latent moral for his own improvement, he resolved to treasure up every word he'd heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. For he had an expectation that the conduct of his future would give him the clue he missed, and he would render the solution of these riddles easy. Okay, so the first group of gentlemen talking about someone who's died, and they're speculating on whether this wealthy man's going to have a cheap funeral because there's going to be no one there, and they discuss making a party to get a free lunch. And then two other men seem to refer to it, but then start to talk about the weather, almost as if they don't care that this man's died. And then Scrooge is thinking, well, it could be Marley's death that they're reflecting on, but that was in the past, not the future. So he's wondering who this man is. Scrooge is not the sharpest tool in the box, is he? So let's continue with he looked. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of life, and thought and hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. Quiet and dark, beside him stood the phantom, with its outstretched hand. When he roused himself from his thoughtful quest, he fancied from the turn of its hand, and its situation in reference to himself, that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder, and feel very cold. They left the busy scene, and went into an obscure part of the town, where Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognised its situation and its bad repute. So they've gone to the rough end of town, guys. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half naked, drunk and slipshod ugly, alleys and archways, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offences of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling streets, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. So just contextually, these are Victorian slums that is being described. And as you know, these dirty places, unsanitary, had a lot of disease. So dirty, squalid, diseased. There's a bit of context there for you. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed beetling shop below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. So it seems to belong to what you would have referred to in the Victorian era as a rag and bone man. Okay, so they'd buy old rags, they'd buy bones. Now the rags would be used, interesting fact, to make paper. So paper production now, they discovered it was a lot cheaper to make it just from wood pulp, but they would use old rags to make paper in the Victorian era. So clothes would start off with someone very fine, and then when that very fine person had outworn it and it was too rough around the edges for them, they'd sell it on, and then someone else would wear it. Maybe they'd turn it like Mrs. Cratchit in her twice turned gown. They'd take the good fabric and they'd turn it into something cheaper, or they'd just wear it and patch it up, and then they'd sell it on. And so there was this kind of chain of people selling on clothes until they were essentially in rags. And so the rag and bone man would buy these rags. I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, aren't I? Rag and bone man would buy these old rags and sell them to be used to make paper. Bones, old animal bones, could be used for making glue. You know that, some of you, from Animal Farm. Let's go with upon the floor. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse iron of all kinds. Secrets that few would like to scrutinise were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat, and sepulchres of bones. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in, by a charcoal stove made of old bricks, was a grey-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who had screened himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtaining of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in all the luxury of calm retirement. So, this is someone who collects junk to recycle, sell off for recycling. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and she was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh. "Let the charwoman alone be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress alone to be the second, and let the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, here's a chance. If we haven't all three met here without meaning it." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said old Joe, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. How it squeaks! There ain't such a rusty bit of metal in the place as its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such old bones here as mine. Ha ha! Well suitable to our calling, we're well matched. Come into the parlour, come into the parlour." Okay, so this is the rag and bone man, old Joe. So it's the guy who owns all the junk. The parlour was the space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked a fire together with an old stair rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold defiance at the other two. "What odds, then? What odds, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Why then? Don't stand staring as if you was afraid, woman. Who's the wiser? We're not going to pick holes in each other's coats, I suppose." "No indeed," said Mrs. Dilber and the man together. "We should hope not." "Very well then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose." So that line, "who's the worse for a loss of a few things like these, not a dead man, I suppose," suggests that something's been stolen. They don't think it'll be missed because it belongs to a dead man. "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw," pursued the woman, "why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself." So, we have the metaphor, a wicked old screw here. So by comparing Scrooge to a screw, suggests that he's sharp. It's that idea of pain, being painful, but also pressure. So you put pressure onto the screw, and as it goes in, it kind of widens and widens and widens the hole because it's in that shape. So the tip goes in, and it only touches it, and then as it more goes in, it gets wider and wider. And there is this idea that Scrooge is compared to a screw because he puts the pressure on people and he keeps turning and turning and making it worse with his loans and his demands for interest and repayment. Okay, and we also have, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? So this idea that his miserly behaviour is not normal human behaviour. It's not natural, it's not normal for people to be cruel like him. If he had been, he'd have somebody, oh right, I've already read this, haven't I? To look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself. Let's turn over. It's the truest word that ever was spoke, said Mrs. Dilber. It's a judgment on him. I wish it was a little heavier judgment, replied the woman, and it should have been. You may depend upon it, if I could lay my hands on anything else. Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We know pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe. So she's admitted here that she's stolen from this chap who's a wicked old screw. But the gallantry of her friends would not allow this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breech first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were severally examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, and added them up into a total when he found there was nothing more to come. "That's your account," said Joe, "and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?" Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. "I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself," said old Joe. "That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off £half-a-crown." "And now undo my bundle, Joe," said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff. "And what do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains?" "Aha!" returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. "Bed curtains! You don't mean to say you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there?" said Joe. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" "You were born to make your fortune," said Joe, "and you'll certainly do it." "I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get anything in it by reaching it out for the sake of such a man as he was, I promise you, Joe," returned the woman coolly. "Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now." "His blankets?" asked Joe. "Whose else's do you think?" replied the woman. "He isn't likely to take cold with that, I dare say." "I hope he didn't die of anything catching, said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up. "Don't you be afraid of that," returned the woman. "I ain't so fond of his company that I'd loiter about him for such things, if he did. You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me." "What do you call a wasting of it?" asked old Joe. "Putting it on him to be buried, to be sure," replied the woman with a laugh. "Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it ain't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one." So, just to clarify up until this point. So the woman has been in Scrooge's house after he's died. Sorry, the man's house after he's died. Sorry, guys. I'm not going back and re-recording this. Sorry. After he's died, and has taken down the bed curtains from around his bed. So if you remember, I was saying about 4-poster beds, how Scrooge has one. It's got curtains around it. Taking down the bed curtains, and taken his bed sheets as well, and left this body just laid there on the bed with no sheets. And then she has taken his best shirt that he was meant to be buried in and put him in a really cheap one, and come to bring the blankets, the curtains and the shirt to sell. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil, with in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself. "Ha ha!" laughed the same woman, when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, told out their several gains upon the ground. "This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit him as when he was dead. Ha ha ha!" Okay, so this is an interesting quote. So we've got this exclamatory sentence, which creates a tone of joy, and they're expressing joy in his death. So death is meant to be a sombre, melancholy time, but they have no sadness that this man's died. And profit is interesting, because if we think about Scrooge, it's role reversal. So Scrooge exploited others to make profit, and now they're exploiting the man to profit. "Spirit," said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot. I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heavens, what is this?" He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he almost touched a bed. A bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay a something covered up, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. So it's clearly the body, this uncurtained bed, but in his mind he can only refer to it as a something. Let's carry on then. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light rising in the outer air fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. So we've got a lovely triplet here. So emphasising how pitiful his death is and the treatment of this guy in death. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next page. Page 54. Okay, it's the last page we're going to do today. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side. So the ghost is trying to get Scrooge to uncover his head, the head of the body, and Scrooge refuses to. "O cold, cold, rigid, dreadful death, set up thine altar here, and dress it with such terrors as thou hast at thy command, for this is thy dominion. But of the loved, revered, and honoured head, thou canst not turn one hair to thy dread purposes, and make one feature odious. It is not that the hand is heavy, and will fall down when released. It is not that the heart and pulse are still, but that the hand was open, generous, and true, the heart brave, warm, and tender, and the pulse a man's. Strike, shadow, strike, and see his good deeds springing from the wound to sow the world with life immortal." So that's kind of Dickens's voice interjecting there. Let's carry on. No voice pronounced these words in Scrooge's ears, and yet he heard them when he looked up upon the bed. He thought, if this man could be raised up now, what would be his foremost thoughts? Avarice, hard-dealing, griping cares? They've brought him to a rich end. Truly interesting. Avarice was a word that's on your vocab grid, and we use that connected with Scrooge. So he's thinking now that thoughts of avarice or kind of petty things don't really matter, because the rich end that we all meet is death. He lay in the dark, empty house with not a woman, a man, or a child to say that he was kind to me and this or that, and for the memory of one kind word I will be kind to him. A cat was tearing at the door, and there was a sound of gnawing rats beneath the hearthstone. What they wanted in the room of death, and why they were so restless and disturbed, Scrooge did not dare to think. "Spirit," he said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving it I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go." Still the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head. "I understand you," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could. But I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power." Again it seemed to look upon him. "If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death," said Scrooge, quite agonised, "show that person to me, Spirit, I beseech you." And that's where we paused today. So let's just go back to this quote. He's got another triplet. Dickens is loving his triplets this chapter, isn't he? So it emphasises the lack of people caring about this man. And then we've got obviously imagery, dark empty house, isolation. So this man has isolated himself. Okay, pause there and make sure you've got those annotations down. So we are going to do a flashcard together before you go off and do your 2 flashcards that you've been set for today yourself. So we're going to look at this quote. "He frightened away every one of us while he was alive to profit us while he was dead." And we're going to start with our 5 W's. So where? So this is Stave for Scrooge visits the rag and bone man / the slums. Okay, so who? It's the washerwoman. It's not technically Mrs. Dilber. What? So she talks about profiting from a mean old dead man. We don't know who it is at that point, but then we find out it's Scrooge. When? So the 3rd spirit takes Scrooge to the future. Okay, and why? Why is that quote in there? To show the consequence of isolation and excuse me, sorry, not coronavirus. Show the consequence of isolation. And what is the word that we learnt that was about hatred for misanthropy? That was it. Okay, so copy that down if you need to. Pause the video. Okay, let's turn over. So we want to start away. We want to start with the technique. So language of money, and our zoom is the verb profit. It's kind of like the message here is you reap what you sow. So Dickens's message is our choices and actions will reflect upon us, especially after death. So if you're mean and miserly in life, well, you're going to get a mean and miserly death. Okay. So let's think. Guess we could also zoom in on frightened. To show the power Scrooge has. This is the first time we've heard of him creating fear. He's been mean, he's made people unhappy, but to also make people fearful, it really amplifies the impact of his behaviour on others. Okay, so pause that and get that down, and then you've got today 2 quotes to make flashcards for by yourself. So follow that